field in Siberia hides an ancient mass grave. On one of the world's loneliest islands, a lifeboat appeared out of nowhere with no one around to explain it, and under ordinary farmland in the Czech Republic, burial mounds have been lying invisible for thousands of years. These are some of the most disturbing discoveries found in the most isolated places on Earth. Out in a quiet field in northern Siberia, archaeologists uncovered a massive grave that's completely unsettling. Inside was a pit with 77 skeletons, dating back to about 2,800 years ago. The way these people died, well, let's just say it wasn't pretty. Most of the victims were women and very young people. Looking at the bones, scientists could see blunt force trauma to the skulls, which tells you right away this was deliberate violence. Whoever did this was methodical. Even stranger is how they were buried. The bodies weren't just tossed into the ground. They were buried with bronze jewelry, pottery, burned seeds, and the bones of nearly 100 animals, including a whole young cow under some of the humans. It almost looks like some kind of ritual. Researchers think this might have been part of land grabs or tribal conflicts during Europe's early Iron Age, wiping out entire families to weaken a rival group. Bouvet Island is one of the loneliest chunks of land on the planet, an ice-covered volcanic speck in the South Atlantic Ocean, closer to Antarctica than anywhere else. Getting there by boat is a nightmare, and the weather is brutal most of the time. But in April of 1964, a British survey team from the Royal Navy's HMS Protector finally touched down on this frozen rock. They were there to check out some newly formed volcanic terrain, but what they ended up finding was something way more weird: a lifeboat sitting in a small lagoon. It was unmarked with no motor and no sails, and around it were a few oars, a barrel, a flattened tank, but zero signs of anyone who might have used it. There were no footprints, no campsite, no bodies. There was nothing to explain how it got there, and to make things stranger, when another team returned a couple years later, the boat was gone. It had vanished without a trace. News of this came out just this month. Archaeologists in the Czech Republic discovered hundreds of 5,000-year-old burial mounds hiding under farmland. Long, narrow mounds called long barrows, built by Neolithic farmers around 3000 BCE. Over thousands of years of plowing, most of them had basically flattened out, so you'd never know they were there just by looking at the fields. The team used aerial photos, laser scanning, and what's called magnetometry. Magnetometry is basically a way to measure tiny variations in Earth's magnetic field, which can sometimes reveal stuff buried underground. With these tools, they mapped all kinds of stuff, including graves and ritual sites that have been sitting under there for who knows how long. And the mounds sit along the edges of old settlements, which means these people were purposely keeping where they lived separate from where they buried their dead, even 5,000 years ago. In 2001, researchers digging at a site on a remote island off the coast of northern Scotland came across what looked like two Bronze Age burials. They found a male and a female skeleton lying in a fetal position. At first, it seemed like a normal archaeological find, but the first red flag appeared when they noticed the skeletons didn't fit the timeline of the site. They'd been dead for centuries before they were actually buried in the ground. But the real strange part came 10 years later during DNA testing. Scientists realized that these were not two individuals. They were composite jigsaw people, kind of Frankenstein creations. What they thought was the female skeleton was actually a collage of a male skull, a female torso, and an arm from some other unknown person. And the male was made up of body parts from at least 3 different men. They hadn't been just thrown together though. The parts were carefully selected so that the joints fit perfectly, making them look like a single person to the naked eye. After these people died, their bodies were placed in a peat bog for about a year. The high acidity and low oxygen in the bog preserved the soft tissue and tanned the skin, basically mummifying them. And for reasons we can only guess, the living then pulled these bodies out of the swamp, disassembled them, and then combined them into the pair that was later found buried in the dirt. It's very weird. High up in the death zone of Mount Everest, the atmosphere is so thin, the human body literally begins to die, cell by cell. And in this isolated wasteland, there's a famous and grim waypoint known as Green Boots. Since 1996, climbers heading for the summit have had to step over or around the frozen body of a man curled in a limestone cave. He's wearing a bright red jacket and neon green climbing boots, The body is widely believed to be Sawang Palajor, an Indian climber who got trapped in a massive blizzard. Because the air at that altitude is too thin for helicopters and too dangerous for human recovery teams to carry extra weight, he was just left where he fell. And over time, the cave became a mandatory landmark for everyone on the North Ridge. Climbers would use his neon boots to measure how much further they had to go to reach the top. For over 40 years, a family of 6 lived in a hand-built log cabin in a corner of the Siberian wilderness so remote that the nearest town was 150 miles away. The Lykovs were old believers who fled into the forest in 1936 to escape religious persecution. They stayed there completely cut off from the rest of humanity until a group of geologists spotted their garden from a helicopter in 1978. When the geologists finally hiked to the spot, they found a family that kind of looked like they were living in the Middle Ages. They were wearing clothes made of hemp cloth and surviving on a diet of potato patties mixed with ground rye and hemp seeds. It was nuts because they had no idea what was happening on the outside, of course. They had no idea World War II happened. They didn't know humans had landed on the moon. They were in their own little bubble. But the isolation that kept them safe also made them vulnerable when they were found. Within a few years of meeting the geologists, 3 of the family members died. Their immune systems had no defense against the modern germs the researchers brought with them. Only one daughter, Agafia, remains. She still lives in that same isolated spot, refusing to leave the only home she's ever known, surrounded by the graves of her family. In the mid-1800s, Sir John Franklin set off to find the Northwest Passage with 2 ships and 129 men. They vanished. Years later, search parties found a few graves on Beechey Island, a desolate rock in the Canadian Arctic. In the 80s, an anthropologist named Owen Beatty decided to exhume the bodies to find out what went wrong. Because the ground is permanent permafrost, essentially a natural deep freezer, the bodies were almost perfectly preserved. So when they opened the coffin of a 20-year-old named John Torrington, the team was met with a pretty terrifying sight. Torrington was staring back at them. His skin was still there, but it had turned a ghostly bluish gray. His eyes were wide open. But probably the most disturbing part was what the scientists found inside him. Torrington's hair contained a massive amount of lead. Turns out the tins of canned food they'd been eating had been sealed with lead solder. As the men sat trapped in the ice for years, lead leached into their food. They weren't just freezing and starving, they were actually slowly going insane and dying from heavy metal poisoning. Dura-Europos was a Roman town in the Syrian desert that was wiped off the map during a siege by Persians in the year 256. When archaeologists started digging there in the 1930s, they found a narrow tunnel underground, and inside it were the bodies of 19 Roman soldiers and 1 Persian. They're all piled together in a heap. Now, at first, researchers thought the tunnel had collapsed on them, but the way the bodies were stacked didn't really match a cave-in. What actually happened was much darker. During the siege, the Persians were digging a tunnel under the city wall to bring it down. The Romans realized what they were doing and started digging their own tunnel to intercept them. When the Persians heard the Romans getting close, they set a trap. They lit a fire using sulfur and tar, 2 materials that produce this thick, toxic smoke. Then they used simple air pumps to push that smoke down the tunnel toward the Romans. When the Roman soldiers rushed forward in the darkness, they would have ran straight into a cloud of poison gas. And within minutes, they were choking and collapsing in a tight space, unable to escape. The Persian soldier found with them was probably the one who stayed behind to keep the fire going. Today, the scene is believed to be one of the earliest known examples of chemical warfare. And this one's really cool. Archaeologists may have found the baddest man to ever live. While working at a 6th century cemetery in northern Italy, they found the remains of a man who belonged to a Germanic tribe called the Longobards. While the other skeletons in the cemetery were buried with standard grave goods, this man was different. His right arm had been amputated at the mid-forearm. Amputations back then were almost always a death sentence. There was such a high chance of infection, and that's if you even made it past the loss of BLOOD. But this man survived for years, and he replaced his limb, not with a wooden stump, but an iron blade. The end of his arm bone showed signs of remodeling. meaning he used the blade for a long time. There were traces of what was likely leather, which he would have used to strap the blade to his stump, and the enamel on the right side of his jaw was worn down to basically nothing. He had a massive infection in his gums. And that tells us he was using his teeth to pull the leather straps tight. He lived in a brutal warrior culture, and rather than retiring after losing his limb, he just turned himself into a living weapon. Deep inside a cave system in the Atapuerca Mountains of Spain lies a chamber whose name translates to the Pit of Bones. To get there, you have to crawl through a nearly half-mile of narrow passages and then descend a 43-foot vertical shaft. At the bottom of this pit, researchers found a massive collection of ancient human remains, at least 28 people belonging to an early human ancestor. They lived about 430,000 years ago, long before modern humans even existed. The most disturbing discovery in the pit is a specimen known as Skull 17. It belongs to a young adult who is otherwise healthy. However, the skull has two very distinct, nearly identical holes just above the left eye. Researchers used modern forensic imaging to analyze the fractures and figured out they couldn't have been caused by a fall down the shaft. Both holes were made by the same object, hitting the skull from two different angles. It would have been a lethal attack. This makes Skull 17 the victim of the oldest cold case in history. 500,000 years ago, in the pitch black of a remote cave, one of our ancestors killed someone and then dumped the body down a hole to hide the evidence. People just never change. And that's been the video for today. I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, next time.